Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. And today we're going to talk about what I think is a very special book. In a way, it brings back good name to the memoir. The book is called The Boy Who Fell Out of the Sky, a true story by Ken Dornstein, and is published by Random House. Thank you for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
I need to open with, I guess we would call this the premise of the book. This will make it very clear to the listeners, which makes them happy. On the evening of December the 21st, 1988, Pam Am Flight 103 left Heathrow Airport outside of London. 38 minutes later, it exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. Your brother, David, was one of the 258 people who died. The boy who fell out of the sky is the story of David and you. I think that sums it up. And those are just words, but trust me, if you get into reading this book at all, you'll feel moved by that description. You put David out of mind for 8 years, and then you decided to visit Lockerbie. Why?
I wouldn't say I put him out of mind. I mean, I knew I had a job. The day he died, I knew I had a job, and it's because he made so many noises about being a great writer, and he had left behind so much writing, and everyone felt there had been a story that there had been a novel with him, and that he was working on it abroad, and that it had been lost with the rest of the debris over the North Sea of Flight 103. And I wasn't sure that was true, but I did know that I had a lot of writing in hand, and what I didn't do was read it right away. I was afraid it might not be what he hoped it would be, and I had all sorts of disincentives for reading it, so I tried to do everything but that. And the trip to Lockerbie, as painful as it sounds to people to go to a place associated with your brother's death, it was actually easier, and so I did it first. It was what started the project.
And when you went there, you met some interesting people, the Lockerbie police, I guess they are. There was a fellow by the name of Inspector Gordon. Is that his name? The one with whom you continue a relationship?
Well, Inspector Gordon introduced me to a man named Brian Sutton. It was a very personal investigation. There really weren't any real facts to establish, but I was establishing so many years later just the reality of the place, and I went there sort of unannounced to the friendship groups that were that had struck up relationships with the American relatives, and I wanted to find out what the place was really like outside of all the news stories that called it the town of hope and healing. The town I found wasn't quite as storied and fantastic as the news story seemed, and the more real the place became for me, the more satisfied I felt that I was sort of getting somewhere. And I think I was really looking for a place. I mean, in some senses, it's very comforting to have a place to go. You have all this feeling, but you're not sure what to do with it. And to have a place to go, the name for all that feeling, for all that grief, was Lockerbie.
Yes.
And I could actually get on a plane and go there in some physical sense, and it helped me sort of access some of the emotions that I was trying to get to, but couldn't. So it was a good way to kind of organize all this energy I had, and it came first.
In a general sense, what you were exploring or investigating is what you call the quintessential 20th century death in an instant. The destruction of Flight 103 is two people asleep on each other's shoulders at 7:02 p.m. and those same two people dead on the ground 3 miles apart at 7:05. And maybe this is why a plane wreck is so universally upsetting. We are proceeding along in life, watching our movie, drinking our drink, eating, doing any of those things, and suddenly we are not doing any of these familiar things, and we never will again.
Yeah, I did quite a bit of research into what's normally hidden about an air disaster. There are all kinds of stories about the aftermath and the legal wranglings, but what I wanted to know was what exactly happened at 7:02 p.m. on December 1988. What really had happened to my brother, and that I found was sort of an underground thing. But there was quite a bit of research, and when I was in Lockerbie, there was extensive testimony that had been taken years earlier in what they call a special investigation into what had happened. And they had treated every passenger on the plane as a separate murder investigation, and they had plotted the grid reference where everyone had come down. And
That's amazing.
I came across something kind of astounding, which is that first-class passengers fell in a very first-class place. Gorgeous rolling hills, as if you could have got that along with your ticket. And the economy class actually fell in the economy class, a sort of housing project in the middle of the city that was near a slaughterhouse. And when you really plotted it out, it was an ironic conclusion.
There was one person's backyard or driveway where a lot of
one woman, a woman named Ella Ramsden. I'm sure he was there, and along with most of the economy class passengers, fell in the backyard of a woman who sort of a pensioner who lived in some what they call council housing, and there were more than 100 people there.
You know, to talk about the blowing up of Pan Am 103 is just to scratch the surface of the boy who fell out of the sky. We're going to dig a little deeper when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. Our guest today is Ken Dornstein. The book is called The Boy Who Fell Out of the Sky. It's a true story, and it's published by Random House. And it is the selection in March of Big Book of the Month Club, which is run by Esquire. And I've never before read any quote from a book club evaluation, but I like this one so much. Whoever it is, and we don't know the gentleman's name at this time. In fact, he says, I can't remember a single passage in The Boy Who Fell Out of the Sky that traffics in empty sentimentality or easy cliche. The series editor for PBS's Frontline, Dornstein, has written a memoir that reads with the unflinching factual intimacy of a coroner's report. And once he's satisfied with the terms of his brother's death, he turns his eye to his life. And here, too, he doesn't pull any punches. What emerges is far from hagiography, more portrait of the artist as a young screw-up. Probably not a whole lot different than you were at 25. That is, until he wasn't. In his exploration of this most universal bummer of a life interrupted, Dornstein has written a book that transcends its subject, becoming a meditation upon not only his brother's life, but his own and all of ours. He's got it right. He's got it right. I mean, you do get at this and you dig, and what comes out is something universal that everyone can relate to, everyone can have feelings about and respond to. You say that you started the book in a sense because the trip to Lockerbie resolved nothing, or perhaps next to nothing is a better way to put it. What were you looking still to figure out after you had the sequence of the crash and some of the investigative stuff in your bag, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it turned out that my pursuit of the facts of the bombing were a kind of preoccupation, maybe a necessary one, but I was kind of treading water before I really got into what I knew was going to be the much harder task of figuring out who my brother was and who he had been for me growing up, and why it still mattered so many years later to get clear on that. There were a lot of reasons why I didn't dive into the topic. One of them was that I had started a few years after he died dating one of his former girlfriends, probably his chief former girlfriend, and I knew that a lot of his writing, she figured into it, and that was a real disincentive. There's some things the new boyfriend doesn't want to know about the old boyfriend, especially when he's your brother. But it wasn't until she and I kept going as a relationship that I realized I needed, for our sake, to kind of disentangle my life from David's. And really, the project took on a new urgency when it became more about me having a future than really kind of disinterring his past.
She understands very well the intimacy, the closeness between you and David. There's a point in the book where she's, quote, going out of your life as though for the last time, And you're right, I stood at the window as the plane pushed back and taxied onto the runway. I watched as it took off and banked out of view. This is how people exit my life, I thought. They take off in planes and don't come back. It was a little self-pitying, considering that I had precipitated the breakup and that Kay wasn't dead. But I felt that I was back on solid ground with thoughts like this. David and I would now be together again, old friends reunited by tragedy, and no one was left to bother us.
Yeah, there's certain narratives that I think we live by sometimes without realizing that they're informing our life so much. Mm-hmm. And I had several narratives going. One was, if I changed nothing about my life from where I had been when David died, if he somehow came back in what sort of Joan Didion calls magical thinking, we would be ready to resume our lives as they were. So that was a real disincentive to making new choices about my life that would somehow advance me from 19, which is what I was when he died. Another story I had was that I was dating his old girlfriend, and that for the most part it was a fine relationship, except that I thought the story I had going was that in order for me to live my own life at some point, I was going to have to break up with her. So we had a fine relationship, but this narrative I had going that I needed to split from her to somehow have my own life is what led to the breakup that was behind the scene you just described there, and kind of examining some of these narratives and rewriting them is what I literally did in the book.
The other thing that you were then, and I guess now, holding in common with your brother is that you both wanted to be writers. And there's a strange point in the book where you have some problems over a book that you had written and published, and it's this problem makes you feel closer to David than you had in years. That's strange. That's a little strange. I don't know. The Boy Who Fell Out of the Sky is essentially a very serious book. However, there is one fall-down funny scene. You're going to hear about it when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast. The Boy Who Fell Out of the Sky is the book. The author is Ken Dornstein. And A.M. Holmes, who's the author of a book called The Safety of Objects, has this to say. A heartbreaking, deeply personal memoir of a brother's quest to know the unknowable, to make sense of what doesn't make sense. Ken Dornstein has written a stunningly haunting, honest work about finding himself. And that's the other piece of this book that I hope we probably haven't done enough to get it across, that as much as it is the story of David, it is your story. Or maybe it's more your story than David's. I don't know. Readers can, add it up for themselves. And as I said, this is a fairly serious piece of business here, this book. But there is I believe, a fall-down funny scene in here. You and David are kind of evacuating Rhode Island, Brown University, which you both attended, and both received degrees. How he got his, I don't know. And but at any rate, you're leaving. Tell us what happens on the trip to the train.
We were late, to say the least, and I think that was David's modus operandi. And I thought there was a lost cause to make the train, and I had a summer's worth of stuff with me in an enormous square suitcase that my father had gotten me for a summer away. I was coming from a summer program and stopped by on the way to see David, and David said, no problem. We can get there to that train. And I didn't think it was possible, but he said, give me that enormous suitcase, and you carry my bag of books, and we're going to get this done. So Providence is built, Brown University is on an enormous hill called College Hill, and to get to the train station, you have to go down a sort of San Francisco scale hill. And we were moving along, and the suitcase had some wheels on it, and David was pushing it along, and then he lost control of the suitcase. And the suitcase took on a life of its own, and it went careening through traffic. And
this was a faux leather suitcase.
It was not of the greatest quality.
No.
And then it started going end over end, and traffic was stopping in two directions as it crossed through intersections, and then it sort of finally came to a stop against a building, and he grabbed it, and the two of us are now carrying it like a wounded soldier, through the streets of the city, and we finally make it on the train amazingly, and David made it seem like this is what I do every day of my life.
David makes the impossible real.
Yeah,
that was one of his qualities, one of his sterling qualities.
In that case, he hadn't written that novel, but he knew how to make a train it seemed like a lost cause.
He also knew how to write letters, and I guess the last letter he wrote, delivered to the family on or about December the 22nd, I think, and it was after the memorial was held, was a letter that he wrote from a place in Israel called the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, it had taken a couple weeks to reach us, and it didn't actually get to our house until days after he had already died.
Dear family, it says, I have walked through the gates of heaven and have entered paradise. And David went on to describe the trees and the flowers and the birds in the Garden of Eden. He made up fantastical animals and wondrous sights that he said he was seeing all around him. It was nice to think of David there. To the extent that Jews have a conception of the afterlife, the Garden of Eden is the place where the good and the righteous ascend, freed now from the cares and burdens and disappointments of this world. Who wouldn't want to receive a letter from a dead relative reporting a safe and sound arrival in heaven? That's making the most of a lousy situation, I think.
Yeah.
For that to come, after the memorial. And then many years later, I'm trying to remember how many years later, 16 years after this letter arrives, you slowpoke, you get around to answering
I was never
it.
quick on the reply.
And this is a time when your life has really come together, certainly on the personal level, and I guess also on the professional level. You're married. You have a son whose name is Sam.
And now a daughter, Sophie. I don't want to leave her out.
Oh, you have a daughter now, too. Oh, how wonderful. And so you finally, after all this time, write this letter. And I would like you to read from it.
Sure. It was really one of the last things. I had created this kind of epic to-do list of things to do around David's life and memory, and this was really the last thing to check off, was to write him back after so many years. And the letter goes in part. I remember looking up at key moments in my own life, and finding you. You were doing your best to be there for me in a way that no one had ever really been there for you, and that, I'd love for you to know now, made all the difference. But I have to go. Catherine, my wife now, and Sam will be home any minute. In some ways, this whole project has been a struggle to get back to the present from wherever it was that I blasted off to after you died. A fall to earth just like yours, but with hope and possibility opening up as I near the ground, not closing off for good. I feel like I've been scratching and clawing my way back for years, and I'm almost there. I hear the car in the driveway. I hear the ding, ding, ding of the door opening. I hear Catherine saying we're home, and I hear Sam in the front hallway saying, choo-choo, and then, Daddy, I've got to go. I'll write more when I can. Still your brother, Ken.
The voice is Ken Dornstein. The book, The Boy Who Fell Out of the Sky. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.